London in 1966 was not kind to outsiders. The city had built its own mythology around the electric guitar, and the men who played it treated their territory like sovereign ground. Eric Clapton had been crowned God, literally, the word spray-painted across buildings in South London like a religious declaration that no one bothered to question. Jeff Beck had taken what the Yardbirds started and turned feedback into a philosophy. Jimmy Page was already plotting something heavier, something that would eventually become Led Zeppelin. And then there was Pete Townshend, smashing instruments as though violence itself could become a chord progression. These four men formed an invisible parliament of sound. They decided what mattered. They decided what was real. They decided who belonged. And in the autumn of that year, a young American guitarist arrived in their city carrying almost nothing, a few clothes, a white Stratocaster, and a kind of silence that made people uncomfortable. His name was Jimi Hendrix. But this story is not about the moment London embraced him. This story is about the night one of its kings tried to dismiss him and what happened when the quiet American was finally handed a guitar. Jeff Beck had earned his skepticism the hard way. Born in Wallington, Surrey, he had spent his teenage years disassembling radios and rebuilding them, teaching himself how electricity and sound interacted at a molecular level. While other guitarists learned by copying records, Beck learned by understanding circuits. He heard music not just as melody and rhythm but as signal and frequency, as waveforms that could be bent, shaped, as distorted into something the human ear had never processed before. By the time he joined the Yardbirds in 1965, replacing Eric Clapton, Beck had already developed a playing style that made other guitarists nervous. He used feedback not as an accident but as an instrument. He bent strings beyond where they should go, finding notes that existed in the cracks between conventional tuning. He made his guitar sound like it was screaming, crying, laughing, and sometimes all three simultaneously. By late 1966, Beck had left the Yardbirds and was assembling what would become the Jeff Beck Group. He was 22 years old and already considered one of the most innovative guitarists in the world. His confidence was not arrogance, because it was the certainty of someone who had pushed his instrument further than anyone around him and knew it. But there was something else about Jeff Beck that people often missed behind the technical brilliance. He was deeply competitive. Not in the loud, chest-beating way that some musicians displayed their insecurity, but in the quiet, watchful way of someone who was always measuring, always calculating where he stood in relation to everyone around him. When word began circulating through London that an American guitarist had arrived and was supposedly doing extraordinary things with a Stratocaster, Beck's first reaction was not curiosity, it was irritation. Americans came to London every few months, blues players mostly, carrying their credentials and expecting the English scene to genuflect. None of them had shown Beck anything he could not already do. So when Chaz Chandler, the former bassist of the Animals, began telling everyone who would listen that he had discovered the most extraordinary guitarist alive, Beck was dismissive. He had heard Chandler talk before. The man was a promoter at heart, always selling something, always convinced his latest discovery would change the world. But the whispers would not stop. They came from musicians Beck respected, people whose judgment he trusted. "Something is different about this one," they said. "You need to hear him." Beck resisted. He had sessions to record, a new band to build. He did not have time to chase rumors about another American blues player with a loud amplifier and a bag of tricks. But the whispers kept growing. They came from studio engineers, from club owners in Soho, and from other guitarists who came back from seeing the American play looking shaken in a way Beck had never witnessed before. Not impressed. Shaken. There is a difference. Impressed is what you feel when someone does something well within a framework you understand. Shaken is what you feel when someone dismantles the framework entirely, when they reveal that the boundaries you thought were permanent were actually just suggestions you had been too limited to question. The encounter happened at a private gathering in London. Biographies and period accounts describe it differently, details shifting depending on who tells the story, but the core elements remain consistent across multiple sources. It was an evening event, the kind of informal industry gathering where musicians, producers, and journalists mixed in a room thick with cigarette smoke and the competitive energy that defined the mid-60s music scene. Beck arrived with his guitar case, prepared to play, prepared to demonstrate why his name belonged at the top of any conversation about electric guitar. He had been told the American would be there. He had been told the American's name was Jimi Hendrix, a former sideman who had played backup for Little Richard and the Isley Brothers before Chandler brought him to England. A sideman. Beck had worked with sidemen his entire career. They were competent, reliable, occasionally inspired, but they were not innovators. They were the people who supported the people who pushed music forward. There is honor in that role, but it is not the same thing as leading. When Beck entered the room, he spotted Hendrix almost immediately. The American was hard to miss, not because he was commanding attention, but precisely because he was not. He sat in a corner with his white Stratocaster leaning against the wall beside him, watching the social dynamics with a quiet intensity that suggested he was cataloging everything. He was wearing a military jacket and his hair was untamed, a visual contrast to the sharply dressed English musicians who treated their appearance as carefully as they treated their sound. Beck studied him from across the room and felt his skepticism solidify into something closer to certainty. Whatever tricks this American had learned on the Chitlin circuit, they were not going to be enough to impress a room full of London's most accomplished guitarists. But there was something else Beck noticed, something that unsettled him. The American's hands. Even in stillness, Hendrix's hands had a quality that Beck recognized because he saw it in his own hands every day. They were the hands of someone who had spent thousands of hours holding a guitar, fingers that had developed calluses so deep they were essentially permanent. These were not the hands of a casual player. Beck noticed, and the noticing made him uncomfortable. Someone suggested they play. Beck was happy to go first. He unpacked his guitar with confident efficiency, plugged into an available amplifier, and launched into a passage that showcased everything that made him exceptional. His fingers moved across the fretboard with surgical precision, finding harmonics that most guitarists did not know existed. He used feedback deliberately, sculpting it into musical phrases that blurred the line between melody and noise. His vibrato was wide and expressive, demonstrating years of practice channeled into every micro-movement. He played for several minutes, and the room responded with respectful attention. He was good. Everyone knew he was good. When he finished, he looked across the room at Hendrix and nodded. "Your turn." Hendrix stood up slowly. He picked up the white Stratocaster with a casualness that bordered on reverence, the way someone might handle a sacred object they had held so many times it had become an extension of their body. He plugged into the same amplifier Beck had just been using. He spent a moment adjusting the settings, turning the volume and tone knobs with small, precise movements, yet listening to the subtle changes in the amplifier's hum as he calibrated the relationship between his instrument and the electrical current. He did not rush. He did not perform the act of preparing to play. He simply prepared, the way a surgeon prepares, with the focused calm of someone who understands that what happens in the next few minutes requires total commitment. Then he began to play. The first sound was not a note in any conventional sense. It was a tone, a single sustained frequency that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than the guitar, deeper than the amplifier, deeper than the room itself. It hung in the air, vibrating with an intensity that made the hairs on Beck's arms stand up. And then Hendrix began to build on that tone, adding layers of sound that revealed dimensions of the instrument that Beck had never accessed. It had never even suspected existed. His left hand moved across the fretboard with a fluidity that defied conventional technique. He was not playing notes the way guitarists typically play notes. He was creating a continuous stream of sound that flowed between pitches, that found the spaces between the notes, microtonal territories that Western music had long ignored, but that Hendrix navigated as though he had been born in those spaces. His right hand was doing something equally extraordinary. His thumb wrapped around the neck to fret bass notes on the low string while his remaining fingers handled melody and rhythm on the higher strings. He was essentially playing two instruments simultaneously, creating a fullness of sound that should have required multiple musicians but was emerging from a single pair of hands. But the technique was not what silenced the room. What silenced the room was something that existed beyond technique, something that lived in the emotional dimension of the sound. Every note Hendrix played carried weight, a kind of human truth that penetrated directly into the chest and settled there with a warmth that was almost physical. He played the blues, but it was not the blues anyone in that room had heard before. It was the blues stripped to its most fundamental essence and rebuilt from the ground up with materials that no one knew existed. It was the sound of someone who had taken the entire history of American music, the field hollers and Delta bottleneck and Chicago amplification and rhythm and blues and soul and gospel, and compressed it all into a single voice that spoke through 6 strings with a power that made everything else in the room feel small. Beck set his guitar down. He did not lean it against the wall or place it in its case. He set it down on the nearest surface with the unconscious gesture of someone who has just realized that the tool they have been carrying is not the same kind of tool as the one they are watching someone else use. It looked the same. It had the same strings, the same frets, the same pickups, but in Hendrix's hands it had become something else entirely. The American played for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, though time had become unreliable in that room, stretched and compressed by the gravitational pull of the music. Quiet passages, barely louder than breathing, gave way to eruptions of sound that seemed to physically push the air. He used the tremolo arm to create sounds that hovered between music and something more primal, cries and whispers and howls that carried emotional information without the mediation of melody or harmony. And throughout all of it, his face remained calm, almost serene. His eyes were closed, not in the theatrical way that some musicians close their eyes to signal depth, but in the genuine way of someone who had gone somewhere internal, somewhere private. He was listening, not to the room, not to the other musicians. He was listening to something inside the music itself, something guiding his fingers to places they needed to go. When Hendrix stopped playing, the silence was not the polite silence that follows a good performance. It was the stunned silence that follows the kind of experience that rewires your understanding of what is possible. No one applauded immediately. No one spoke. Beck stood motionless. His hands hung at his sides with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. In a few minutes, his entire understanding of his instrument had been expanded and humbled in a way that felt both devastating and strangely liberating. Beck did not touch his guitar again that evening. This detail, confirmed across multiple accounts from that era, speaks more powerfully than any verbal reaction could. Jeff Beck, one of the most accomplished guitarists in the world, a man whose identity was inseparable from his instrument, chose not to play after hearing Hendrix. And not because he was defeated in some competitive sense. He chose not to play because he understood, with the immediate clarity that only genuine mastery can provide, that he needed time to absorb what he had heard before he could meaningfully contribute to any musical conversation. This was not the reaction of someone who had lost a contest. This was the reaction of someone whose entire map of possibility had just been redrawn. What makes this encounter significant beyond its immediate dramatic impact is what it reveals about the difference between excellence and genius. Beck was excellent. By any objective measurement, he was among the best guitarists alive. His technique was formidable, his innovation genuine, his musical intelligence deep. But Hendrix operated on a different axis entirely. He was not better than Beck in the way that one athlete might be faster than another, where the difference is measurable along the same spectrum. Hendrix was different in kind. He had access to a dimension of the instrument that was not on Beck's map because it could not be reached through the route Beck had taken. Beck had arrived at his mastery through analysis, through understanding the physics of sound, through systematic exploration of technique and tone. Hendrix had arrived through a pathway that nobody could fully explain, a pathway that seemed to bypass the conscious mind entirely and connect the fingers directly to something deeper, something that lived beneath thought and theory. The aftermath unfolded over weeks and months. Beck, to his extraordinary credit, did not retreat into defensiveness or denial. He did not dismiss what he had heard as tricks or gimmicks. Instead, he did something that required genuine courage. He went back to his guitar and began listening differently. He started exploring the territories that Hendrix had revealed, not by copying techniques, but by applying the fundamental lesson Hendrix had inadvertently taught, that the guitar contained more possibilities than any single approach could access. That mastery was not a destination, but a direction, and there were always more directions to explore. In the months that followed, as Hendrix's fame exploded across London and then the world, Beck watched with a complicated mixture of emotions. There was admiration, genuine and deep. There was something closer to awe, the feeling of watching someone do things you had dreamed of doing but could not quite reach. And there was a kind of gratitude for the expansion of possibility that Hendrix represented. Every time Beck picked up his guitar after that evening, he picked it up knowing that it contained more than he had previously understood, and that knowledge, painful as its acquisition might have been, was a gift. Years later, in interviews conducted throughout his long career, Beck would address that period with characteristic English understatement. He acknowledged that Hendrix had changed his understanding of the guitar. He acknowledged that hearing Hendrix play had been one of the most significant musical experiences of his life. But he rarely spoke about the emotional weight of that experience, about the vertigo of having your entire professional identity expanded in the span of a few minutes, and about the courage it took to pick up his guitar the next day knowing the landscape had changed and that he needed to find his place in the new terrain. What Beck did with that knowledge is perhaps the most important part of this story. He did not quit. He did not retreat into bitterness. He did not spend his career trying to be Hendrix. Instead, he absorbed the lesson and channeled it into becoming more fully himself. Beck would go on to have one of the most remarkable careers in guitar history. He continued to innovate, to push boundaries, to find new sounds that influenced generations of guitarists. The Jeff Beck Group, with Rod Stewart on vocals and Ronnie Wood on bass, created music that laid groundwork for heavy metal and fusion. His later work exploring the intersection of rock and jazz and electronic music demonstrated a restless creativity that never settled for comfort. But those who knew him well understood that something fundamental had shifted in Beck's approach to music on that evening. He played differently afterward. Not because he was imitating Hendrix, but because he had been given permission to search for things he did not yet know how to find. There is a difference between a musician who believes they have mastered their instrument and a musician who understands that mastery is an illusion, that the instrument will always contain more than the player can access, that the work of discovery is never finished. Before that evening, Beck may have been approaching the first kind of musician. After that evening, he became permanently the second, and Hendrix himself seemed largely unaware of the impact his playing had on those around him. This is one of the most remarkable details across accounts of his early London period. He did not play to destroy other musicians' confidence. He did not play to prove superiority. He played because the guitar was the language through which he communicated most fluently, because making music was as natural and necessary to him as breathing. The devastation he left in his wake was simply a side effect of being himself. He could not see his own playing from the outside, and from inside, it did not feel extraordinary. It felt like the only thing he knew how to do. When Hendrix died in September of 1970, at the age of 27, the loss carried an additional dimension for the guitarists who had encountered him personally. They had not just lost a great musician. They had lost the person who showed them that the instrument they dedicated their lives to contained infinities they would spend the rest of their careers trying to reach. Beck continued playing for decades after Hendrix's death, continuing to innovate, continuing to demonstrate that the guitar was an instrument with no final frontier. And every time his fingers found a new sound or a new way of bending a string, there was an echo of that London evening when a quiet American picked up a white Stratocaster and showed him that the map was bigger than he had ever imagined. Some encounters change what you can do. Rarer encounters change what you believe is possible. And the rarest encounters of all are the ones that change both simultaneously, in leaving you standing in a new landscape with the same instrument in your hands but a completely different understanding of what it means to play it. That is what happened to Jeff Beck on the night he heard Jimi Hendrix for the first time, and the fact that he responded not with defeat, but with decades of renewed creative exploration may be the greatest tribute one guitarist has ever paid to another. Because the true measure of greatness is not whether you can silence a room. It is whether you can inspire the people in that room to go further than they ever thought possible. Jimi Hendrix silenced Jeff Beck for one evening, but he inspired him for a lifetime.